Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the Industrial Revolution, the time period when technology basically takes the world and absolutely changes it in dramatic ways that still impact us today. It allows a whole slew of innovations to come about, but also allows those innovations to get in the hands of the normal person faster. It really just creates a whole new way society is designed. Let's remember that prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to the industrial times, most goods are produced at home. And everybody at that time is living for survival. There's really not that many businesses. And those merchant classes that came out of things like the Renaissance, they primarily worked for royal families or the Catholic Church. And so the average person lives on their land. That land is part of a common village land. Of course, they have limited resources. Whatever's around them is what they're going to have to use to live. And it's not really efficiently worked and run. So, what we want to see here is how do we build society up to a greater potential? Well, we know that in England, where the Industrial Revolution occurs, there's plenty of land, labor, and capital because this whole area is the British Empire. There's so many different materials and so many different types of people and so many different types of capital inventions that are coming out of these locations that it's just a matter of bringing them together and then getting the right conditions for government and business together where it's going to just kind of explode. And so that's part of the reason why the Industrial Revolution happens here. There's just the perfect conditions for it. Number one, coal and iron are coal starts as being really plentiful in most of northern England, but iron is also starts being made in factories in a much greater capacity. You have the idea of capitalism, where the government allows private ownership and really rarely interferes. Now, this has downsides, of course, but up until this point, the royal family is always stopping innovations from happening, and it prevents them. In this case, it just goes unfettered, and there are again downsides to that. But the end result going forward is that the people's lives are much better off. This is a very small country, England, and it is an island. And so the most important part of its system are the rivers and canals that exist there. And canals are basically man-made waterways to connect one location to the other. And once you get the rivers and canals down, you can get them to the port cities quicker and therefore engage in trade. And because you have British colonies, you have so many different places to get those natural resources from those other colonies. Like the United States, you get things like tobacco and lumber and that kind of thing. And then you also have markets that already exist there, consumers, because then you take your finished goods and you sell them back to those markets. So Britain is in the perfect condition to deal with this. Last time we looked in the last section, we had the agricultural revolution. And because you had the enclosure movement and food was being made so much more cheaply, amazing amount of people left the countryside, the rural areas, and went to the urban areas, the cities. And what this does is it creates a plethora of workers to start conducting the Industrial Revolution. First thing that needs to happen is we need to get some inventions going. And so we have Richard Arkwright in 1763 that says, well, what we need to do is that we need to figure out a way where the humans aren't the power or the animals, the domesticated animals are not the power. And to do this, he gets a water frame. So a water frame is a device that basically is turned by water. It turns a variety of gears within a large building, which of course, turns the gears of something like a loom or something to grind flour or to grind wheat or something like that. And so what this does is it allows the mass production of primarily initially clothing. And clothing is the textile industry. And it's mostly wool and cotton. And this new technology then takes it out of the hands of the people to power it and puts it in the hands of machines to be able to make it at a much quicker, more consistent pace. And so this new technology actually makes it easier and eventually cheaper to make goods. I have my time to do other things I want to do because the machines are actually doing the work. Eventually, you get away from water, and the new energy source that takes over that power is coal. And of course, there's huge upsides to coal. It burns hotter, it burns more efficiently, it's plentiful all over the country, And at the same time, you don't have to be next to a river to do a factory. Is there a downside of coal? Of course, there's a downside. There's enormous amounts of pollution, and that becomes a huge problem going forward. But it does allow also machines to continuously run, all right, because you have that power source being that coal. Now, we need an engine though that's going to, produce power that's going to run on coal. And that engine happens to be something called the steam engine that is perfected by James Watt. And the idea being that you have a boiler, that boiler boils water, which produces steam, which maneuvers pistons, which produces power. And eventually, this is what the factories are going to run on. Mainly, it starts again, textile factories with clothing, but then you start getting into other things like transportation that's going to solve an enormous amount of problems. And that transportation is in the ideas of steamboats and trains. Now, steamboats are a really, really big deal because you can get across those canals, those man made waterways, faster than regular horse-drawn boats that go through canals where the horse is walking up the side and pulling the barge along. But it also can go upriver much, much more efficiently. So that idea of the current is impacting your ability to transport. Not that big a deal when you have a steamboat. Of course, trains allow for faster transportation of people and products at a much quicker pace and much heavier tonnage that can be moved as well. And it makes it much easier for people to get from the countryside, which is still a ways away from the city, to the city. And so urbanization, that development from a town into a city structure, that really kicks into high gear once the steam engine actually gets going. Eventually, the industrial revolution actually becomes a global thing and around the world. First, it starts in England, then it moves to France and Germany and the Netherlands, and eventually the United States and the world. And it becomes a globalized thing. Other countries start to colonialize even more, and that gives Europe the resources to uh, proliferate their goods and markets to sell them in. And because Europe was making them so fast and so efficiently, they could sell them for really cheap. And so you'd get European goods all over the planet. Thing is, you still need to feed the machine to make the products. And so this does something else around the world, and it creates the main cause for the act of imperialism. And imperialism is simply when an empire or a country simply takes the land from somebody else to gain their resources. That's it. I want your land, I want your labor, I want any capital. And so what I'm going to do is just walk in and take it. And that's imperialism. You start to see the rise of imperial powers, the British, the Germans. Eventually this will be the United States, but also the Japanese, the Chinese. You have imperialist powers all around the world starting to kind of rise and starting to acquire and take resources from other countries. Urbanization does have considerable downsides. People do move to cities where they have factory jobs. They work 6 days a week. The conditions are really terrible. You have the beginnings of what are called slums. These are overcrowded, dense urban areas. Remember, the government has kind of just left and said, capitalism, go, do your thing. And it's going to be better off in the longer run, but in the shorter run, people come to these cities. There's disease, there's crime, there's pollution. You have tenement housing, and tenement housing is basically large blocks of buildings that contain multiple families. They're comparable to large apartment buildings, but you have multiple families in one little tenement house. They're sleeping in shifts. It's a coal-fired stove that's probably providing warmth, and so you have the smoke of the coal in there too. It's just really not good conditions whatsoever within the city. Um, you have a new set of classes. No longer do you have like the peasant and the aristocracy, meaning the royals, the merchants. Now you have a new group of classes that comes out of the Industrial Revolution. You have the elites. This represents about the top 3% of the population. And you have the middle class. The middle class are going to be professionals. These are going to be people that actually have a definable skill, or maybe they're educated. And so this represents about 20% of the population. Primary bulk of the population is working class. Is the people that are going to be doing the very physical, hard, cheap labor. They do have a day off. They aren't like basically working to survive, but they're working to get paid to try to survive, which is a step up, even though it's a small step up. And then you have the working, the not even working, the poor. Most of these are rural poor that are trying to still living based on whatever they grow. This represents about 7% of the population. Factory work is 12 to 16 hours a day. It's very dangerous. Child labor exists. About 14% of the workforce is under 14 years old. They're usually paid a fraction of what the normal workers get. Eventually, labor unions are going to come along where the workers and the management actually negotiate pay and working conditions. But something awful needs to happen to get there. And what's awful that's happens is that you have child labor, really horrible working conditions, little or no pay, depending on if you're an orphan, you're not getting paid at all. And so that has to be the result of the Industrial Revolution. Speaking of some results of the Industrial Revolution, what does all this happen besides the technological change that makes life considerably better going forwards? Government starts to step in and become a major impact. Trade unions actually start forming, and so workers start to strike for greater pay, less working hours, less child labor, better working conditions. Governments start to realize that this has kind of gone amok, and we need to pass laws to help people that are working in these conditions. So child labor laws that people under the age of 14 couldn't work at a factory or in a coal mine condition. Housing regulations started to pop up as you got into the later 1800s. So indoor plumbing needed to be required, that you couldn't have necessarily a common outdoor pit toilet. You'd have better materials, better, like not necessarily building codes, but you had to make sure that whatever that place was actually livable and not something that would just fall apart if there was a small tremor. You started to have standard 8-hour work days that were going to be implemented. People had to work in shifts if you needed other work done. Minimum wage started to be discussed for people working really difficult jobs. But something else actually starts to become apparent in the early mid 1800s, and that's a guy named Karl Marx, who is watching this happen, and a new theory starts to pop up. Remember, we had capitalism where private owners owned land, labor, and capital. Now you have socialism start to pop into people's vocabulary. And in socialism, government owns land, labor, and capital. And there are some of these people that looked and said, wow, the Industrial Revolution was so bad that the government needs to come in and will be able to make better decisions than private owners of land, labor, and capital. And we will see some of the impacts of that going forward. One of which is Karl Marx creating a pamphlet that contains a new political theory called communism. And in communism, you have no private property. The community, which ends up being pretty much the government, owns all businesses. There are no social classes, so you don't have elites, middle, upper, and poor. You're going to force equality on everybody. And there is no religion or anything like that. This is the attempt to make kind of the perfect equal society. And as we will see, it has some pretty negative impacts for people's lives going forward. So that is the results of the Industrial Revolution. We have our technology, for pre-industry Britain. We have our technology. We have the workers' impacts. Then we have the results, which is these laws that actually do make lives better for the workers overall. So, Industrial Revolution, huge time in world history when we suddenly make an enormous jump in society, totally shifts and changes.